Hello everyone, and welcome to Cloud Automation Guide, where we simplify DevOps, cloud, and automation for everyone. Today, we're diving into one of the most critical topics when it comes to automating responsibly, approval policies. I'll show you how to create approval policies so that you can protect your environments without slowing down innovation. Let's get started. What are approval policies? Approval policies in VCF Automation are governance checkpoints that make sure critical deployments are reviewed before moving forward. Whether you're protecting production environments or managing high-cost workloads, approval policies allow you to inject human review exactly where it's needed, without sacrificing the speed of cloud automation. So let's take a look at how to create an approval policy and leverage it to provide governance within your cloud environment. So for this use case, what we're going to do is we are going to create an approval policy, which will fire off. Basically, it will require an approval if a deployment is going to go into the production environment. What the result will be is that users will be able to deploy or request resources in development and test environments without any approvals being required. But anything that is going into a production environment, an approval must be given. So a couple things that we need to make sure are in place before we get started. One, we have to take a look at our cloud template, and we actually have to configure a tag on the cloud template that will capture a user provided input, basically the user specifying the environment where the virtual machine is going to be built. And then that will be the tag that will be evaluated to see whether or not, the approval actually has to fire. So the first thing we need to do is we need to come to Assembler and take a look at our cloud template. So we're going to go to Design, and then we're going to take a look. I'm going to use this demo Linux template. I've actually already modified. If you've been watching any of my other videos or any of the other tutorials I have at cloudautomationguide.com, you'll recognize this template. We've been using it before. So the one thing that you have to be aware of, especially if you've been following along or you're familiar with using constraint tags, is that the tags that are evaluated within an approval policy, you can evaluate tags. Those are not constraint tags, right? There is a tag here that's on the VM, but what is evaluated by an approval policy is not a constraint tag. It is actually a tag. So there is a property on the virtual machine that you configure called tags. This is similar to if you are in the project setup for, when you're building out a project or you're messing with a project, right? You can come in and take a look at the projects. You can actually specify tags that get assigned to the virtual machines, right? That is the same as over here in the design, this tags property. So if you were to configure something on the project saying everything deployed from this gets tagged with this tag, you would actually see that tag created here. Well, not necessarily here in the cloud template, but when the virtual machine gets deployed, you would see a tag created on that virtual machine. So to support this use case for having an approval policy evaluating a tag, we actually have to add something in our cloud template. In this case, what I'm doing is basically I'm evaluating a tag. You'll see in the approval policy where I evaluate both the key and the value. You don't have to do that in the approval policy. You could just have a whole bunch of tags, and you could just say, hey, if any of the tags values has this value, it'll execute. But for this example, what we're doing is we're just doing this key value pair for a tag. So that's set up, we're ready to go. All we need to do now is go over to the service broker and define our approval policy. So let's walk through that. So you come to the service broker, click on Content and Policies, go down to Definitions underneath the policies, New Policy. So this is where all your policies are defined. You should recognize this if you've watched anything about the content sharing that we did before. So you're going to click on Approval Policy, and then we got a few things to fill out. So we're going to fill out a name. We'll call this Demo Tag Approval Policy. And then you have your scope. Do you want to assign this to the entire organization or multiple projects or a single project? If you were to do the entire organization and then that's it, this approval policy applies to everyone. If you want to have it apply to multiple projects, then you have to put in criteria, like what's the project name? Equals, doesn't equals, matches expressions, contains, whatever, right? And that would be group one. And then if you wanted another project, you could do another, basically another thing. If you wanted to apply it to, and then this is like an or statement. It has to be this or this or this. And if it comes to a project, you don't have, you can do and, but it's not going to work because you don't have multiple projects, one project with multiple names, unless you want to say, like I've got my dev tier one, dev tier two, whatever, and you could do or clauses where the name contains something, right? Um, or if you wanted to do a single project, you just do a single project and choose the project that you want it to apply to. In this case, I'm just going to do the entire organization. And then criteria. Criteria is where we are actually going to say you're going to look at this property within the deployment request in order to see whether or not you need to fire. So there's two things that it fires on. We're going to get into the actions piece, but the actions is one piece, the criteria is the other. But this is where you're like, hey, if somebody's requesting a VM with more than 4 CPUs and or 8 gigs of RAM, it's in the criteria. In this case, we're looking for tags that are on the resource. So we're going to say the resource has any tags, and those tags has any of the following. So in this case, our key, remember our key was environment, and it's nice that it autofills for you so you can kind of poke around and play. And then you can say, or the value, and the value equals, in this case, we're going to do prod. This, as it sets up, right, says that any deployment that has a key which equals environment or has a tag value that equals prod. But that's not what we want. We want our tags to say the tag key has to equal environment and the value has to equal prod. Then that's one half of the criteria for this approval policy firing. I'm going to skip down to the other half, and that's on what action do we want this to apply, or do we want this to fire? So this is basically, do you want this to approval policy to fire when the virtual machine is being reconfigured? Do you want this policy to apply when, say, the machine is being created? Let's see, like in this case, like, do you want this only to apply to, say, cloud vSphere machines, right? Is it being rebuilt? Uh, is it being reprovisioned? So there's all sorts of different places that they could fire. I don't see one in here that says create or allocate, right? For this use case, basically what I'm going to be looking for is when the deployment is being created. So during the deployment create phase, right, evaluate whether or not the deployment has a tag where the key is environment and the value is prod. If those two conditions are met, fire this approval policy. So now we have that out of the way. Now we can go ahead and configure, okay, which priority does this approval policy fall within all the approval policies? So the lower the number, the higher the priority. All approval level ones get processed first, then twos, then threes, then fours. So that's just something to bear in mind if you're looking the way you're designing your approvals and how that's going to work. I'm going to keep this as a one. It's the only one. Then your approval type. Do you want it to be user-based? In other words, specify the users and or groups that have to give the approval, or do you want it role-based? Role-based is basically pick a role within Aria Automation, like project administrators or supervisors. Those are on the project that says who can actually give approval or approve or deny this request. I'm going to keep user-based. I'm going to add some users. I'm going to add my default Aria Automation admin, and I'm going to add my domain administrator. Those are the two people in the list. Now, do I want it to where either one of them can approve, or do both of them have to approve? Um, the all method is helpful from the perspective if you're specifying groups. You just have to be careful with the all method. Like if you're trying to say this department has to give an approval and then this department also has to give an approval. Um, if you have a large amount of users or multiple users, or you have groups with large amounts of users, because it will enumerate the membership of the groups, every single one of the members of the groups has to give approval in order for this to work. A better method, in my opinion, if you want to say, hey, look, the finance department has to approve, the project owner has to approve, the infrastructure team has to approve, you would then create multiple approval policies with the same criteria for the same phase with different approvals. Like maybe number one would be, the projects, not the Aria automation project, but the organization project, that management, the people who are managing that, who probably have bills, they're probably being charged for consumption, et cetera, make them number one. Do an approval policy for them, make them number one, put their users or groups in here, and then do any if the organizational way of doing things, the organization, if that's the way they want to do it, or you could do in that case like role based, right? And you could say, the project administrators, any of them can approve it. And then you do another policy at level 2 that says, it's maybe user based, and you would put in a group of like the finance group, right? And say any of them, if that's the way the organization runs things, that anybody who's in this group can approve, and then it moves forward. And then you would have maybe number 3 for your infrastructure, your virtual infrastructure team who's managing the back end, right? And then have the group and then do any. So that's how you can you can layer your approvals and target basically the organizational groups without having to require, like the intent is this group and this group and this group have to all approve, but you don't want to have 50 users all giving a yes or no in order to be able to let this move forward. So that's a little bit on that piece. In this case, I'm just going to do any. And then you have what happens if all of the approvals have not been given by the time our timeout period expires. Do you want to automatically approve the request, or do you want to deny it? A lot of times you're just going to have an auto reject. Again, it all depends upon the needs of the organization. But generally, why are you doing an approval policy if the intent isn't to prevent somebody from deploying something unless it's been, approved? So, you know, just again, whatever the needs of the organization are, put that there. Then the expiration trigger. How many days do you want this request to be sitting waiting for approval? Um, you want to give it long enough for the people, talk to the teams that you're dealing with for the approvals. You want to give it long enough for them to have a chance to approve it, but you don't want it to be so long that the user's sitting around waiting for 30 days for their request to go through. So 7 days, typically a week, you know, that should be enough time. Again, it depends upon the needs of the organization. For this example, it's going to be pretty quick. I'm not going to sit here and make you wait for 7 days to see what happens. But just know that if this approval was in process for 7 days, according to this policy, and it was not approved, then it would be rejected automatically. We already touched on the actions. You saw all the actions that were there. You've got stuff that you can run on cloud, like if you want to resize the instance, right? And for some reason it was, you had up here was more than X number of CPU and Y bit of RAM, it would deploy on that. Now, this being said, is if this was a CPU and RAM type criteria up here, I'm not restricted to running this approval policy only in the create. I could have, it's going to create, and also at the same time, when you're, let me see if I can find it. So if I'm resizing an EC2 instance. This approval policy will fire both when the deployment's being created and when I'm resizing it, right? And if it's more than a certain amount. Because of the criteria up here, this doesn't make sense, so we'll get rid of that. Yep, delete the action. Right? Now everything's set, so let's click create. And now we have our approval policy. So, and see, its enforcement type is hard. It will run. It will run for every project in the organization. And it's an approval policy. So let's go back to our cloud template and let's run it. And I'm going to do two. I'm going to do a dev deployment first. Actually, let me do a prod deployment first. Prod approval demo. Give it a name. I'm going to give it VM1. Doesn't matter the network. I'm going to do, I said prod. So let's do prod. And now that that's going, let's do a test. What did I just call it? Approval demo test VM2. Let's do the database network, and we're going to do, let's say dev. Yeah. Well, let's just do test. It doesn't matter. Deploy. All right, so we look at our deployments. Let's take a look at our prod first. Come to the history, see what's going on with it. All right, we're allocating. Good. And here in a couple seconds, we should see it's checking on an approval policy. And we should see here shortly that it pops up and that there is an approval being required. So see, waiting for administrator to approve the request. Why? Well, let's take a look at the topology and let's take a look at the tags that are being shown on this virtual machine. So we clicked on the VM, come down to the custom property. Let's take a look at, do we have tags in here? There we go, up top. Tags, environment prod. Well, we were looking for ENV prod. We got ENV prod. Now we have an approval. If I was to come back over here to deployments and look at the test, right, and look at the history, right, we'll see no approvals are required. Why? And that's because over here on our virtual machine, the environment is test. All right. So now that we know, we see that the approval policy is working, how do we approve or deny the request? Well, what's going to happen is that within Service Broker on the inbox, I don't have this Aria Automation environment integrated with an email server, but if I did, the people who are the approvers would receive an email. They would then have to log into Aria Automation and come over here on the Service Broker tab and click on Inbox. So here is an approval sitting here waiting for me. What do? I click on it and I have basically two things I can do. I can approve or I can reject it. So this is, remember when I talked about the approvals, the approval levels, level 1, level 2, level 3. So if I had basically the same policy, approval policy, but defined multiple times as multiple approval levels, I would see here which approval level that was. So I can basically approve or reject it. If I approve, it'll just move on. I can give the reason and I hit approve and it will get approved. If I hit reject, I come in here and give a reason, wanting to cancel demo, and then I reject it. I've now rejected it. So if I come back over into the deployment and take a look at the approval demo and take a look at the history, I will see it starting to delete because config admin rejected, and this is why. So the user, what'll happen is the user will actually see this as a result. They'll get a little, once it's all done cleaning up, they'll have a status of that this failed and then it was rejected, and they can come in and they look and they see, why was it rejected? For whatever reason. Maybe somebody, accidentally screwed up and gave them the ability to deploy to prod. They shouldn't be deploying to prod, or maybe there was some sort of, information that was missing from the request that should have been provided, something. but at least the user can see what's going on as far as why their stuff was canceled. Whereas if we take a look at the other deployment, it's running through just fine and it's been deployed and ready to go. So with all that done, what are some takeaways from all this? First off is balancing risk and agility. What this means is basically keep it simple. Like most architectural concepts, the simpler, the better. You want to provide flexibility and speed to your users without compromising the infrastructure. So in other words, don't implement approval policies for the sake of implementing approval policies. Make sure they're useful. And also, like when it comes to designing your policy, don't make the delay as far as the time period um, as to which to allow approvals to be waiting to be approved to be too long. 7 days, 3 days, 2 days, whatever. Um, try to minimize the negative impact to your user. If users are happy with the platform, they will use the platform. If they are not happy with the platform, they will not use the platform and they will go somewhere else. Happens all the time. Uh, if you can, like in the example that we did today with tagging, try to use dynamic criteria. So granted, a lot of the times we use approval policies are for things like, we want to make sure that people aren't building monstrous virtual machines, with 32 CPUs and, gobs and gobs of RAM, right? Those have to be hard coded. But if there's other things like, hey, we want to make sure that, people are being able to deploy where they need to deploy without approvals, but, like in this example, using tags, that's another one. Make sure that your approval policies, especially with, their levels, mirrors your organizational structure. You're supposed to be fitting in to the organization and supporting the organization, unless this is part of a project that is, we are completely going to redo how we do things and we're going to do, shift the whole paradigm, whatever. You know, make it useful. Again, not only are you trying to be useful and desirable to be used by your users, you also have to make sure the people who have to support it and the organizational structure also finds it quote unquote user friendly. Lastly, like most things with the infrastructure, keep an eye on it. Make sure that approvals aren't timing out. Maybe the timeout's too long. Maybe you need to get some management involved in order to find some external process that will force approvals to be given or denied, within the time period, so that way the stuff's just not timing out. Um, Ultimately, governance should be an accelerator, not a bottleneck. That's probably the most important thing to take away from all this. All that said, thank you for watching this video. If you found it helpful, check the links below for the full blog post and other videos in this series. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel to stay up to date on the most recent content. If you're looking for downloadable content and tools to help streamline your VCF automation journey, head over to cloudautomationguide.com. Thanks for watching and happy automating.